welcome back to my channel Life Without School. If you haven't already subscribed, definitely do that and hit the bell so that you get notifications. I had a couple of comments on my last video that were like, I'm not seeing your videos. You have to hit the bell, I think, to even find out about them. Yeah. So I feel like I'm about to wrap up the third in a series. So in our first video we looked at this concept of family wisdom and how no one can say there is one way to unschool, because each family is completely unique in how it experiences the world. Things like brain wiring, health, personalities, characteristics, privilege and lack of privilege all impact how we are able to embody unschooling. And in last week's video, I considered this idea that when you say there's only one way to unschool and count everything else as less than, it's actually really problematic and actually a manifestation of unaddressed privilege. I'm really grateful for the way that you have conversed with me in the comments. I have personally found so much insight from you sharing your story, so thank you. I'm super grateful. Please continue to have this conversation with me, particularly around today's topic, because this is one where I'm going to float an idea and I want you to just take this idea and run with it and let me know if it is resonating for you, or actually if you think, nope, that is rubbish. I'm here for that feedback 100%. I really feel like unschooling is some sort of a common good, and it's such an undelved area, like, because we live in such a school fixated culture. There is not really enough conversation happening about unschooling. I would personally love to see way more discussion and thought and analysis about this whole sphere. So here I'm going to float something. I want to hear how it resonates. So in unschooling community, we spend a lot of time looking at concepts like self-regulation. A lot of people consider that self-regulation is really at the heart of what we're hoping for our kids to come round to. That if we give them enough freedom, they will be able to only have a moderate amount of screen time or a moderate amount of sweets or whatever. So it's quite interesting. There's all sorts of things we could pull apart about self-regulation. But I recently proposed this idea that self-regulation and our kind of obsession with our kids self-regulating is possibly very heavily influenced by a second wave of unschooling that we are coming out of now. Let's take a little bit of a look at what I mean by that. I say second wave because I actually believe that the first wave of unschooling was obviously not called unschooling at all. It was simply learning within community, and it is really what most of humankind has done since forever, and that some indigenous cultures have done until very, very recently in a totally natural way. It's been children are born and raised and learn within community with no concept of filling brains with knowledge, but simply learning tools and skills within the natural resources of the community. So I think that that was really the first wave of unschooling, although obviously it's not unschooling but more some kind of deinstitutionalized education. Okay, and then I think the second wave of unschooling really came about when John Holt decided to call it unschooling. And this was when a few more people really got on board with this idea that children should be free to learn without curriculum. This was a really important phase in the life of unschooling because through John Holt's work and other modern writers and thinkers, the word got out and people had more examples of it happening and there was more info. However, because it all sort of unfolded in the 70s and 80s, I think that it was really influenced by other kind of political schema that were going around at the same time. So things like neoliberalism. In fact, by kind of looking back at first wave and second waves of unschooling, I feel like it could be largely said that the first wave was kind of communal, influenced by very ancient ideas of us not really being separate from one another. You might even say influenced by values of equality and egalitarianism, because we kind of had to be that way because everybody's wellness was wrapped up in each other's wellness. Whereas this second wave of unschooling has been influenced by individuality, perhaps more of a value around freedom. And you'll notice that those two core values, equality and freedom, are the spectrum on which our political ideologies have been run on for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. It's what wars are fought over and what political parties seek to represent, left or right. And it's interesting to me to see how they also show up in our unschooling communities. So also, alongside this second wave of unschooling that was quite individualistic, like at its worst, it's summed up in Margaret Thatcher's saying, "There is no such thing as society, there is only the individual." But at its best, really influenced by individual human rights and conversation about consent and body autonomy. So don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to be kind of dualistic and say, oh, the first wave was communal, it was all great, ancient stuff is always better, and this modern thing was too individualistic and just too modern and we need to go back to the old ways. I'm not really saying that at all, because actually history also tells us that it was actually the worst time to be a child in some respects back then. But what I'm saying is that neither were necessarily good or bad, but they were really quite different, and that there is an opportunity to take from each wave the best as we enter into what I believe is actually a third wave of unschooling. I believe that this third wave is being made manifest by writers and practitioners such as Akila S. Richards, who was on my YouTube channel a few videos back. Highly recommend checking in with her podcast and her books, because I feel like she is really pioneering a new way of doing this self-directed learning. So I'm gonna offer up a little quote from Akila's most recent book, Unschooling as Liberation. I feel like this sums up a little bit of what this third wave of unschooling feels like. So she's talking about her own deschooling process, and she says, "The schoolish lens was fading, and the connection, the bridge rather, between learning and the type of liberation I wanted for myself and for my children to define for themselves was in fact leadership, a sense of confident autonomy, an ability to navigate the world with a strong sense of self that includes compassion for other people, an appreciation of being part of various communities, contributing to those communities and others on purpose and in love. Confident autonomy also includes an awareness of their place in the world as they, not the world, define it." So this is different to the kind of radical unschooling that I was chatting about last week, or the unschooling that a lot of people think of, which is very much focused on an individual child's rights and needs being met above all else. While it might have had a place in wrenching us out of adultism, I feel like there is now much more room for unschoolers to contemplate individual rights and needs within a community. So to consider self-determination within a community. I can remember when we first moved to our land 5 years ago, and in a quite popular radical unschooling space, somebody asked about creating an intentional community and living in an intentional community. And you know, I piped up like, yeah, we have just moved into an intentional community with other unschoolers. But I was really a lone voice, because a majority of people on that thread, and one a woman I really respect still, you know, said I would never live in community because it would mean I couldn't prioritize my children's rights and needs. And that comment has stayed with me for so long because I felt like tiny subconscious part of me has been like, maybe I'm not fully able to do unschooling in its purest form because I live in intentional community. And actually now, I don't feel like that at all. Now I feel like what a gift to my children that they are being raised in a place where everyone's needs and everyone's rights are on the table, and they're getting to see and figure out and work out how we grow and evolve and respect and honor ourselves while respecting and honoring other people too. I have no answers, really. Maybe just an invitation for you to consider where you are drawn or where you think our unschooling movement is at right now, where you think our unschooling movement is emerging. I feel like that is one of the big questions, and when we get together at unschooling camps and unschooling get-togethers, I can see that this is the area where it will all fall apart. This is the potential for conflict. This is the potential for people to turn their backs and run away, is basically this sort of tension between those two kind of paradigms. And what does it look like when we really take the best of those two paradigms and forge a new way, where we go, how do we honor our children and their rights and their needs to express themselves and climb, whilst also honoring and respecting the adults' needs for wellness? And I hope that by trying to name it and trying to pull it apart a little bit, we can begin to see and begin to bring more intention to our unschooling spaces. And we can say, when conflict comes up, we can articulate, we can be like, oh, maybe we're having a little bit of tension around those values of freedom and equality and sovereignty and community. Let's figure out how we can make this whole thing work. You know, I hope that maybe by naming it, our unschooling communities and groups can be really empowered to embody a third paradigm. Yeah, so no answers, a few invitations, and very much, hopefully, a start of a conversation. I'd love to hear from you. Feel free to share this around and bring others into this super important conversation as well. Oh, and also, I have just launched registrations for Disco, which is a 5-week course for people considering unschooling or wanting to bring more intention and more attunement into their current unschooling lives. And, you know, maybe you need a little bit more inspiration or a little bit more guiding or just a little bit more support. I'll share some links below. I'll also link to Akila's work too. Much love and take care.